She had 1 minute left to save her master's shop, and she was about to lose it over a fallen stone. The gown in Vivian's arms was worth more than everything she owned. Pale blue silk, hand-stitched over 3 sleepless weeks, folded against her chest. Every step she took across the palace grounds was a prayer that she would not stumble in the dark. She had never been permitted through these gates before. Girls from the lower district did not walk the manicured gardens of the royal palace. They delivered to the servants' entrance and were sent away with a coin and a cold look. But tonight, the head footman had waved her through, snapping that Lady Margaret was waiting and there was no time for the proper way around. So Vivian ran. The great hall glowed ahead of her, golden light spilling from tall windows, the faint sound of violins drifting out into the cold spring night. She could hear laughter in there, the clink of crystal, a world she would never be part of, humming just beyond the glass. She lifted her skirts and hurried along the gravel path, her worn boots crunching, her breath fogging in the air. Almost there, almost. Her toe caught the low stone border edging the rose beds. For one horrible moment she was falling, and all she could think was, the gown, protect the gown. And she twisted her whole body so that she landed hard on her hip and her elbow instead, cradling the silk to keep it from the wet earth. The pain shot up her arm. She barely felt it, because when she looked down, she saw the tear. The delicate hem had caught on the sharp edge of the stone as she fell, a clean rip, 3 inches long, straight through the finest silk in the capital. The threads splayed open like a wound. Vivian stared at it. The violins played on inside the hall. She sat there in the cold gravel and the dark, and she understood, all at once, exactly what this meant. Lady Margaret would not pay. Lady Margaret would tell every noblewoman she knew, and Mr. Fenwick, her master, who had taken her in at 12 years old and taught her everything he knew, would lose the shop he had spent his whole life building. The tears came before she could stop them. Not delicate tears, great gulping sobs that shook her shoulders, the kind she was far too proud to let anyone see. But there was no one to see her here, in the dark garden, so she let herself weep. "I take it the ball is not to your liking either." Vivian's head snapped up. A man stood a few feet away, half in shadow beneath a flowering tree. He was tall, dressed in black so fine it seemed to drink the moonlight, a dark tailcoat cut close to a strong frame. His face was sharp and unreadable, the sort of face that belonged in a portrait rather than a garden. He held a glass of wine he did not appear to be drinking. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the ruined gown, her cheeks burning. "Forgive me, sir, I'll go. I shouldn't be here." "No," he agreed, "you shouldn't." He stepped closer, and the moonlight caught his eyes, a cold, clear gray, the eyes of a man who was used to being obeyed. The whole of the royal court is inside, and yet the only interesting thing on these grounds is a girl weeping into a wall. Explain yourself. There was something in his voice, an edge of command that ought to have frightened her. But Vivian was too wretched to be frightened. She had already lost everything. What more could this cold stranger take? "I've torn it," she said, her voice cracking. She held out the gown, the ruined hem trembling in her hands. 3 weeks of work. It's for Lady Margaret, for the ball tonight, and I've torn it. And now she'll ruin my master. And it's the finest thing I have ever made in my life. He looked at the gown, and then, to her surprise, he did not laugh, or sneer, or call for a servant to have her removed. He crouched down, right there in his beautiful black coat, and examined the tear. "You made this?" he asked.
Every stitch. His long fingers traced the silk,
Not the tear, but the bodice, the seams, the tiny hand-sewn flowers hidden along the neckline that no one but a tailor would ever notice. He studied them the way another man might study a rare book. "The work is exquisite," he said quietly. "The hand that made this is worth 10 of the women wearing gowns inside that hall." Vivienne blinked. Of all the things she had expected, kindness was not one of them. And there was something odd in the way he said it, not the smooth, empty flattery she'd heard nobles give one another, but plain and certain, as though he were simply stating a fact. "You don't understand, sir," she said. "It doesn't matter how fine the work is. It's torn. Lady Margaret will not care that I—" "Lady Margaret," he repeated, and his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Yes, I know her rather well. Tell me your name." She hesitated. A girl like her did not give her name to gentlemen in dark gardens. But something about him made lying feel pointless. "Vivienne, sir. Apprentice to Mr. Fenwick of the lower district." "Vivienne." He said it slowly, as if tasting it. He rose to his full height, and now she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You speak of your fabric as if you love it. Do you know how rare that is? I have stood in that hall for 2 hours and heard nothing but people admiring things they do not understand and praising each other for lies they do not believe." He turned toward the light of the great windows, and for a moment his face looked almost tired. "Go home, Vivienne," he said. "Mend your gown. You clearly have the skill." "And Lady Margaret? Let me trouble myself with Lady Margaret." He glanced back at her, and there was something in that cold, gray gaze now, some spark of interest that had not been there a moment before. "Go, before the footman finds you, and I'm forced to pretend I never saw you at all." Vivienne curtsied clumsily, clutched the gown, and fled back into the dark. It was only much later, lying awake in her small room with a needle in her hand, that she realized she had never asked the stranger his name. She would learn it soon enough, and when she did, she would wish she had run in the other direction. Vivienne had not slept. By the time the gray light of morning crept through the shop window, the terror was gone, truly gone. She had unpicked the whole hem and rebuilt it, thread by thread, matching the pale blue silk so closely that even she had to hold the gown to the candle to find where the damage had been. Her fingers were raw, her eyes burned, but the work was flawless, and for one small moment, standing alone in the quiet shop, she let herself feel proud. Mr. Fenwick found her there at dawn, still in yesterday's dress, the gown pressed and waiting on its stand. "You mended it," he said. He was an old man now, stooped from 40 years bent over a workbench, his spectacles forever sliding down his nose. He came close and peered at the hem, and his face went soft with wonder. "Vivienne, I could not have done this. Not at my best 40 years ago." "Lady Margaret will come this morning," Vivienne said. "She'll take it and pay and never know a thing was wrong." She believed it, too. That was the worst part. Lady Margaret arrived just before noon, sweeping through the low door of the shop as though the very walls offended her. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 30, dressed in deep plum, her dark hair piled high beneath a bonnet trimmed with more feathers than scents. 2 footmen trailed behind her, and behind them, a maid whose eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "Where is it?" Lady Margaret said, not a question. Mr. Fenwick brought the gown forward himself, holding it up with both hands. "My lady, finished to your exact specification. If I may say, it is among the finest pieces to leave this shop." Lady Margaret snatched it from him.
She turned it in the light, her sharp eyes traveling over the bodice, the sleeves, the skirts. For a moment, Vivienne dared to hope. Then the lady's gaze dropped to the hem. She went very still. She lifted the fabric close to her face, closer, until her nose nearly touched the silk, and Vivian's stomach turned to ice, because she knew that a woman like Lady Margaret, who had nothing in her life but the finding of faults, would find this one. "This has been repaired," Lady Margaret said. The shop went silent. "My lady," Mr. Fenwick began, "the work is—" "Do not speak to me of the work." Her voice rose, sharp and carrying. "I ordered a gown, not a mended rag. Do you think I cannot see it? Here, and here. The threads sit differently. This is not the gown I paid for. This is ruined." "It is not ruined." The words left Vivian before she could stop them. Lady Margaret turned. She looked at Vivian as though a piece of furniture had spoken. "And who is this?" "My apprentice," Mr. Fenwick said quickly. "She meant no, it is not ruined," Vivian said again, stepping forward, her chin high, though her heart pounded. "I mended it myself. There is not a seamstress in the capital who could find that hem if I did not point to it. You had to press your face to the cloth to see it, my lady. No one at any ball ever will." She should not have said it. She knew that, even as the words came out, but she had spent the night bleeding onto that silk, and she could not stand to hear it called a rag. Lady Margaret's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "You dare," she breathed. "You dare speak to me." She flung the gown down onto the counter as if it were something filthy. "I will not pay a single coin for this. Do you hear me? Not one. And you may consider our arrangement finished. I will never again set foot in this hovel." "My lady, please." Mr. Fenwick's voice broke, and it was the sound of it, the naked fear in an old man's voice, that made Vivian's anger collapse into something colder and far worse. "The materials alone. I have already paid for the silk, the labor, That is no concern of mine." Lady Margaret drew herself up. "And I will tell you this for nothing, tailor. Every lady I know will hear of what passes for craftsmanship in this shop. The Ashfords, the Winters, Lady Caraway, all of them. By the week's end, there will not be a woman of standing in this city who would let you hem a handkerchief." She looked at Vivian one final time, and her lip curled. "You have your insolent little apprentice to thank for it." She turned and swept out. The footman followed. The door banged shut behind them, and the small bell above it jangled, then went quiet. Mr. Fenwick lowered himself slowly onto his stool. He did not look at the gown on the counter. He looked at his own hands, spotted and trembling, folded in his lap. "The silk," he said softly. "I paid Gregson for the silk on credit, and the rent is due at month's end." He was quiet a long moment. 40 years, Vivian. This shop was my father's before mine." Vivian knelt beside him. Shame sat in her throat like a stone. "It's my fault," she said. "I tore it. I spoke out of turn. I'll make it right, I swear it to you. I'll take extra work. I'll go without wages. You did nothing wrong." He patted her hand, but his eyes had gone far away, and that frightened her more than any shouting could have. "You mended a gown better than any tailor alive, and it counts for nothing because a cruel woman decided it should. That is the way of the world." Vivian had no answer to that. She stayed kneeling beside him as the afternoon light slid across the floorboards, both of them silent, the ruined future of the shop pressing down on the little room. Neither of them noticed the carriage across the narrow street. It was a fine carriage, black and glossy, out of place in the mud of the lower district. It had been there since before Lady Margaret arrived. Behind its small window sat a man in a plain gray coat, not a nobleman, but a servant of one, with sharp eyes and a quiet manner. He had watched the whole scene through the shop's front window, He had seen the lady arrive, and rage, and leave. He had seen the old man crumple and the girl kneel beside him. Now he tapped the roof twice with his knuckle. "Home," he told the driver. "His Grace will want to hear of this at once." The carriage rolled away down the lane, and inside the shop, Vivienne wiped her master's tears and did not know that her ruin and her rescue were already being spoken of in the same breath. 2 days passed, and they were the longest of Vivienne's life. No orders came. Word traveled fast in the capital, and Lady Margaret had done exactly as she promised. A woman who had ordered a walking dress sent her maid round to cancel it. A merchant's wife who had spoken of a whole trousseau went cold and silent. Mr. Fenwick sat at his bench each morning and pretended to work, sorting through buttons he did not need to sort, and Vivienne watched him grow smaller by the day. She had begun to think about what she would do when the shop closed, whether she might find work in a mill, or as a lady's maid, or scrubbing floors in some grand house where no one would ever again let her touch fine silk. The thought was a gray and endless thing, and she did her best not to look at it directly. Then, on the 4th day, a carriage stopped outside. Not a fine carriage, a merchant's carriage, sturdy and plain, drawn by 2 good horses. A man climbed down, round, red-faced, prosperous, dressed in a sober brown coat and a waistcoat straining at its buttons. He looked at the shop's faded sign, checked a paper in his hand, and came inside, the bell jangling above him. Mr. Fenwick rose at once. "Good day to you, sir. How may I be of service?" "Fenwick's tailoring?" the man said. "You'd be Fenwick, then." "I would." "Good, good." The merchant rubbed his hands together and looked about the small shop with a shrewd, appraising eye. "My name is Barrow. I act on behalf of a gentleman of considerable means. A gentleman who prefers, for reasons of his own, that his name not be spoken. He has heard your shop does exceptional work." Vivienne, standing at the back by the fabric shelves, went very still. "He has need of a great deal of clothing," Barrow went on. "A full wardrobe, in truth, coats, waistcoats, riding attire, evening dress, all of the finest make, and he has a particular condition." He turned, and his small eyes found Vivienne across the room. "The apprentice is to do the drafting and the measurements herself. He was most insistent upon it. The young woman, no one else." Mr. Fenwick's mouth opened and shut. "Vivienne? But I am the master here. Those are his terms." Barrow reached into his coat and drew out a leather purse, heavy enough that it thudded when he set it on the counter. "And this is his deposit, paid in advance, in full, before a single stitch is sewn. He is not a man who haggles." Mr. Fenwick stared at the purse. With shaking hands he loosened the drawstring, and when he saw what was inside, he had to sit down. It was more money than the shop earned in half a year. It would pay Gregson for the silk. It would cover the rent, not for 1 month, but for many. It would keep the doors open and the fires lit and the lamps burning. It was, quite simply, salvation, dropped onto a worn wooden counter by a stranger. "Sir," Mr. Fenwick said, and his voice was thick, "I hardly know what to say. Your gentleman is generous beyond—" "He has his reasons." Barrow set a second paper on the counter, this one covered in a neat, close hand. "Here are his requirements. His measurements shall be taken at a time to be arranged, but these are his preferences. He wishes the fabrics to be chosen accordingly." He tipped his hat. "I'll return in 3 days for the young woman's answer on the designs."
"Good day to you both." And he was gone, the bell jangling, the carriage rolling away, before either of them had quite understood what had happened. Mr. Fenwick laughed. It was a strange, cracked sound, half a sob. "Saved," he whispered. "Vivienne,
We are saved. A whole wardrobe. Whoever this gentleman is, God bless him. God bless him 100 times. He pressed his hand to his eyes. Read it. Read what he wants. Let us begin at once, before the man changes his mind. Vivienne came forward slowly and took up the paper. She read the first line, and something cold stirred in her chest. Wool of the darkest charcoal, superfine, from the northern mills. No pattern, nothing that draws the eye. She read on. Waistcoats of deep gray silk, plain, without embroidery. Linen of the highest count, white only. Coats cut close and severe. The gentleman does not care for ornament. He wishes to be dressed well and noticed little. Her hands had gone quite still. She knew these preferences. She had seen them, not written down, but worn. A tall man in a garden, in a black coat so fine it drank the moonlight, cut close and severe, without a single ornament to draw the eye. A man who had crouched in his beautiful, plain clothes to trace the flowers she had hidden along a neckline. A man who had said, "The hand that made this is worth 10 of the women wearing gowns inside that hall. Let me trouble myself with Lady Margaret." "Vivienne?" Mr. Fenwick was watching her face. "What is it? What's the matter?" She could hardly speak. The whole shape of it came clear to her all at once. The timing, the terms, the strange insistence that she and no one else must do the work. The gentleman of considerable means who wished his name unspoken. The wardrobe that no man could truly need all at once. It was him, the stranger from the courtyard. He had heard what Lady Margaret had done. Somehow he had known, and rather than come to her openly, he had sent a merchant with a bag of gold and a false errand, buying a wardrobe he did not want so that she would not know he pitied her. Pity. The word landed in her like a stone dropped in still water. He thought she needed saving. He thought her master's shop was a charity case to be quietly bailed out by a nobleman's spare coin, and that she would never be the wiser, and that she would go on drafting and measuring and stitching in grateful ignorance, while he congratulated himself on his kindness. She had spent the night bleeding onto Lady Margaret's silk to prove she was more than a lower district girl to be dismissed. And now this stranger, this duke or lord or whatever he was, had decided she was a creature to be rescued. "Vivienne, you are frightening me. Is something wrong with the order?" She looked up at her master, at his hopeful, tear-worn face, at the purse that had lifted 40 years of fear from his shoulders in a single moment. "No," she said quietly, folding the paper closed. "Nothing is wrong with the order." But her jaw was set, and her mind was already made up. She would find out exactly who this gentleman was, and then she would return every coin to his face. Finding out his name took Vivienne less than an hour. She asked Barrow's driver, who had lingered at the corner tavern, and a coin loosened his tongue. The gentleman of considerable means, he said, was none other than the Duke of Ravenscar, Alistair Thorne, the coldest and most eligible man in the whole kingdom, whom half the mothers of the capital had thrown their daughters at, and who had never once looked twice. A duke. She had wept in front of a duke and told him her name. The next morning, Vivienne put on her one good dress, wrapped the leather purse in a cloth, and walked to the upper district. She had never been so far up the hill before. The streets grew wider as she climbed, the mud giving way to clean-swept stone, the crowded shop fronts to tall houses set behind iron railings. Grand carriages passed her without slowing. Ladies in fine pelisses glanced at her plain dress and looked away. By the time she reached Ravenscar House, a great pale mansion with black doors and 100 glinting windows, her courage had begun to fail her. She climbed the steps anyway and knocked. The butler who opened the door was a tall, silver-haired man with a face like a closed drawer. He looked at her for one long moment. "Deliveries," he said, "are received at the rear." "I'm not here to deliver anything." Vivian lifted her chin. "I've come to see the Duke." The butler's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, which, on his still face, was as good as a shout. "His Grace does not receive callers without appointment. Certainly not." His eyes moved over her dress. "Not of your description. Good day." He began to close the door. Vivian put her hand flat against it. She did not know where the boldness came from. Perhaps from 3 days of anger. Perhaps from 40 years of her master's fear. But she held the door and looked the butler dead in the eye and said, "Tell His Grace that the tailor's apprentice has come to return his money. Tell him Vivian is at the door, and that if he will not see me, I shall stand on these steps and tell the whole street exactly what a duke does with his charity." The butler's mouth thinned. For a moment, she thought he might have her thrown down the steps. Then a voice came from within the house, low, dry, faintly amused. "Let her in, Hargreaves." The Duke of Ravenscar stood at the top of a wide marble staircase. In daylight he was, if anything, more forbidding than he had been in the garden. Tall and lean, dressed in the very charcoal wool she had read of on Barrow's paper, his dark hair swept back from that sharp, cold face. He came down the stairs without hurry, one hand trailing the banister, watching her the way a hawk watches something small in the grass. "You found me out," he said. It was not a question. "You did not make it difficult, Your Grace." Vivian stepped past the appalled butler into a hall so grand it made her dizzy, a floor of black and white marble, a chandelier the size of a cart, portraits of stern, dead lords climbing the walls. She did not let herself look at any of it too long. She held out the wrapped purse. "I've come to give this back." Alistair reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped a few feet from her. He did not take the purse. "Come into the study," he said. "I'll not conduct business in a hallway like a footman." The study was lined floor to ceiling with books, a fire burning low in a marble hearth. He shut the door on the hovering butler. Vivian set the purse down on his great desk with a heavy thud. "Every coin is there," she said. "The wardrobe is cancelled. My master does not yet know it was you, and I would prefer he never did. So I have told him the gentleman changed his mind." Alistair looked at the purse, then at her. "You are refusing more money than your shop earns in a year." "Yes." "Because?" "Because it is not an order." Her voice shook, and she hated that it shook, so she made it louder. "You do not want 40 coats and a dozen waistcoats, Your Grace. You want the same 6 severe black things you already own. You invented a wardrobe because you heard what happened with Lady Margaret, and you decided to be kind. You wrapped your pity in a merchant's coat and sent it down the hill, so that I would take it and never know I'd been given alms." The Duke was very still. "I did not weep in that garden to be rescued," Vivian went on, and now the words came fast, all the anger of 3 days pouring out of her. "I mended that gown better than any tailor alive, and it earned me nothing because a cruel woman said so. And then you, a duke who has never wanted for anything, you looked at me and saw a poor girl to be quietly bought out of trouble. I would rather my master's shop close honestly than have it saved by charity dressed as trade.
I want to be paid for what I make, Your Grace, not for what I am. The fire cracked in the silence. Vivian's heart hammered. She had just shouted at a duke in his own study. Men had been ruined for less. She waited for the cold fury, the summons for the butler, the ruin of everything. Instead, Alistair Thorne did something she had never once seen a nobleman do. He inclined his head. "You are right," he said, "and I apologize." She stared at him. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who take whatever I offer and thank me for it," he went on, and something in his cold voice had shifted, grown quieter. "I did not think it an insult to simply solve your trouble. It did not occur to me that you would rather earn your own way. That was arrogance, and I am sorry for it." He studied her, and the faint spark she'd seen in the garden was back in his grey eyes, sharper now. "But I confess you have put me in a difficulty. For I do, in fact, want to give you my money, and you will only take it for honest work." "Then give me honest work," Vivian said, "or give me nothing." A slow, considering look crossed his face. He walked to the fire, then turned back to her. "Very well. One coat, one only, designed and made by your hand, for me to wear." His eyes held hers. "But it must be good enough to pass before the harshest fashion critics in the capital, without them knowing a lower district girl had made it. If it does, I shall pay you what it is worth, and you may say you earned it. If it does not," he smiled, thin and challenging, "then we shall both know the truth of you. Do you accept?" Vivian looked at the purse, and at the duke, and at the challenge glittering in his eyes. "I accept," she said. The work began the next morning, and it changed everything. Vivian had made coats before, but never like this. Never with the whole weight of her own future stitched into every seam. She rose before dawn and walked to the textile warehouses at the edge of the district, where the great bolts of cloth came in from the northern mills and the merchants haggled in the cold half-light. She had a duke's coat to build, and she would not build it from anything less than perfect. "2 shillings the yard," said Gregson, the cloth merchant, folding his arms over the bolt of charcoal superfine. "And that's my kindness to Fenwick, God rest his purse." "It's marked at 1 and 6. Vivian ran her hand along the wool, feeling the weave, the give, the way it fell. "And there's a slub in this length, here, near the selvage. You'd not sell it to a gentleman's tailor at full price, and you know it. 1 shilling. Gregson scowled, but he sold it to her at 1 and 3, muttering that Fenwick had taught his girl too well. She brought it back and laid it out on the great cutting table, and for 2 days she did nothing but look at it and think. A coat was not merely cloth. A coat was a man, how he stood, how he moved, what he wished the world to see of him, and what he wished to hide. And the man in question was a puzzle she had only begun to work out. The fittings were held at Ravenscar House, in a quiet room off the library. The first was stiff and formal. Vivian measured the Duke's shoulders and the length of his arms in near silence, calling out figures to herself, careful never to let her hands linger. He stood like a statue and said almost nothing. But by the third fitting, something had loosened. "You frown when you work," Alistair observed, watching her pin the canvas mock-up across his chest. "I'm thinking, Your Grace." "About the coat?" "About the man." She sat back on her heels. "You hold your right shoulder higher than your left, only a little. Most tailors would cut both sides the same and leave you looking crooked in your own coat. I mean to build it so you stand straight." She looked up at him. "May I ask why you hold it so?" Something flickered across his face. "A fall from a horse, years ago. I broke it, and it set poorly." "No one has ever noticed. I notice cloth for a living," she said, "and what it sits upon." He was quiet a moment. "Yes," he said, "I begin to see that you do."
The fittings grew longer after that, and the talk grew easier, and neither of them quite marked when it happened. She told him about the warehouses, about Gregson and his slubs and his kindness that was really shrewdness, about rising in the dark and the ache in her fingers by candlelight and the particular joy of a seam that lay perfectly flat. She spoke of her master and how he had found her at 12, half-starved outside the shop, and taught her everything he knew without ever asking a thing in return. And Alistair, who had never spoken plainly to anyone, found himself speaking plainly to her. "You said I have never wanted for anything," he told her one gray afternoon, standing at the library window while she pinned a sleeve. "That is true, and it is also the whole trouble of me." He watched the rain streak the glass. "My father was a hard man. He raised me to trust no one, because everyone who came near wanted the name or the money or the influence. And he was right. They did." He turned. "In 31 years, I do not think a single person has spoken to me as you did in that study, as though I were a man who might be wrong, and not a duke who must be obeyed." Vivian paused, a pin between her lips. She took it out. "That sounds a very lonely way to live, Your Grace." "It is efficient," he said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, it is lonely." She saw him differently after that. Not the cold duke the whole city feared, but a man who had been taught so young to expect betrayal that he had built himself a fortress and forgotten there was a person locked inside it. And he, in turn, began to understand her world, the grinding labor of it, the way a single cruel word from a woman like Lady Margaret could unmake 40 years of a good man's work, the quiet dignity of people who had nothing but their craft and their honesty. The coat took shape between them, charcoal superfine, cut close and severe, exactly as he liked, but with things hidden in it that only she would ever know. A collar shaped to make him stand straight, buttons of dark horn, plain to the eye, cut by hand so no two were quite alike. And beneath the collar, where no one would ever see it, a single line of thread in deep midnight blue, the same stitch she hid in the neckline of every gown she made. Her mark, her signature. "What is that?" he asked when he found her sewing it. "My name," she said. "Not written. Every tailor worth anything leaves something of themselves inside the work, where only they know to look. It tells you the maker cared." She tied it off. "You wanted a coat no critic could fault. This is the part no critic will ever see, and it is the part that makes it mine." He looked at the small blue stitch for a long moment. "Hidden work," he said softly, "that matters more than the visible kind." "Yes, Your Grace." "Alistair," he said, "when we are alone, and there is no one to be scandalized, my name is Alistair." Vivienne did not answer that. She bent back over the collar, but her cheeks had gone warm, and he saw it, and neither of them spoke of it. The days ran together, the warehouses at dawn, the library in the afternoon, the coat growing finer and truer with every hour. Somewhere in the pinning and the measuring and the long, quiet talk, the great gulf between them, the gulf of blood and money and rank that had seemed so wide in his marble hall, had narrowed to the width of a cutting table, and then to nothing at all. She began to look forward to the walk up the hill. He began to invent reasons for another fitting when the coat needed none. And when she left in the evenings, the great house felt emptier to him than it ever had before, which was a thing the Duke of Ravenscar did not know what to do with. Neither of them was foolish enough to say what was happening, but both of them, alone in the dark, had begun to think it. The trouble began with a walk down the promenade. The coat was finished but for its final pressing, and Alistair had insisted on walking Vivienne partway home himself, which no duke had any business doing. She had protested. He had ignored her, in the pleasant way he had lately learned to ignore her, and offered his arm, and after a moment she had taken it. They walked down the high street promenade in the pale afternoon light, the wide, fashionable parade where the well-born strolled to see and be seen, past the luxury boutiques with their painted signs and their windows full of French lace and Italian silk. It was a foolish place for them to be seen together, and Vivienne knew it, and for one bright half-hour she did not care. She should have. Lady Margaret saw them from across the street. She was standing outside a fabric boutique with two other ladies, and she went rigid at the sight. The Duke of Ravenscar, the coldest and most sought-after man in the kingdom, the man she herself had angled after for 2 full seasons without so much as a glance, walking arm in arm and smiling, actually smiling, at a lower district tailor's apprentice in a plain grey dress. The blood drained from her handsome face. Then it rushed back, and her eyes narrowed to slits. By the following morning, the whole of upper society was talking. The story that spread was not the true one. The true one, that a duke had commissioned a coat and found himself charmed by the honest girl who made it, would not have done. The story that spread, carried from drawing room to drawing room on Lady Margaret's poisoned tongue, was a different thing entirely. The tailor's girl, it was said, was a schemer, a cunning little climber who had wormed her way into Ravenscar House under the pretense of a commission and set about ensnaring the Duke. She flattered him. She had bewitched him somehow, this clever nobody, playing the wounded innocent to trap the kingdom's greatest prize. And her poor master's shop was surely in on it, using the girl as bait to draw the custom of the gullible. "They say she has no shame at all," murmured Lady Ashford over her tea. "Chasing a duke, a girl of her sort." "They say the whole shop is a den of tricksters," said Lady Caraway. "I always thought there was something low about that Fenwick." The rumour spread the way fire spreads through dry thatch, and it reached the lower district within days, and it did exactly what Lady Margaret had built it to do. The orders that had begun to trickle back to Fenwick's shop stopped. Then they reversed. A merchant's wife who had ordered a spencer sent it back unpaid, saying she would not have her name spoken alongside such a shop. A draper who supplied Fenwick's thread suddenly wanted his account settled in full, at once, in coin. 2 ladies who had booked fittings did not come, and did not send word, which was its own kind of answer. Vivienne watched it happen and felt the ground open beneath her a second time. "It has begun again," Mr. Fenwick said. He was standing at the window, watching a lady cross to the far side of the street rather than pass his door. He did not sound angry. He sounded tired in a way that frightened her far more than anger would have. "They are saying things about you, about us. In the market this morning, a woman would not sell me eggs." "I know." Vivienne's voice was very small. "I'm sorry. It's the Duke, being seen with him. I never should have—" "You did nothing wrong." He turned from the window, and his old face was gentle and terribly sad. "You have never once done anything wrong. That is what breaks my heart. You are the finest tailor I have ever taught, and the whole city has decided you are a wicked girl, and there is not one thing either of us can do to change their minds." He sat heavily on his stool. "A poor man's daughter cannot walk beside a duke, Vivienne. Not in this world. They will not allow it. They will burn everything you touch sooner than allow it." Vivienne had no answer, because he was right, and she knew he was right, and the worst of it was that she had let herself forget. For a few golden weeks in a warm library, she had let herself believe that a hidden blue stitch and a duke who called her by her name might mean something, that the width of a cutting table was a real measure of the distance between them. It was not. The real distance was the whole promenade and the marble hall and the 100 glinting windows and the poison in Lady Margaret's smile. It was the eggs the woman would not sell her master. It was a shop dying, Again, for the second time, because a girl who cut cloth had dared to walk in a world that was not hers. She went to Ravenscar House that evening, though it was not a fitting day. Alistair met her in the study, and one look at her face told him something had broken. "What has happened?" "They're saying I trapped you," she said. Her voice was flat and hard, holding back everything underneath it. "That I schemed my way into your house to snare a duke. Lady Margaret has told the whole city, and every customer we had left has gone, and the drapers want their money, and a woman would not sell my master eggs this morning, Alistair. Eggs!" She laughed, and it was a wretched sound. "So you see, your challenge is a fine one, but it hardly matters now. There will be no shop left to save. There will be no reputation left to build. They have decided what I am." He took a step toward her. "Vivian, don't!" She held up a hand, and she was fighting tears now and losing. "Don't be kind to me. If you are kind to me, I shall not be able to bear it. I let myself forget who I was. That was the mistake. A tailor's girl does not belong in your library, Alistair, and she does not belong on your arm, and the whole city has just told me so, in a voice I cannot argue with." She drew a shaking breath. "Perhaps this was always going to end this way. Perhaps I was foolish to think otherwise." The Duke of Ravenscar stood very still in the firelight. He did not tell her she was wrong. He did not offer money or comfort or an easy word, because he had learned by now that she would refuse all three. He simply looked at her, this fierce, weeping girl who had shouted at him in his own study and mended a torn thing better than any one alive, and something settled in his cold gray eyes that had not been there before. A decision. "Go home," he said quietly. "Finish the coat, and whatever you hear said of you between now and the Royal Exhibition, I am asking you to trust me. Only until then." "Alistair." "Trust me, Vivian." His voice was low and certain. "I have never asked it of anyone in my life. I am asking it of you." The grand Capitol Hall had never looked so magnificent, and Vivian had never felt so small standing inside it. The Royal Fashion and Textile Exhibition came but once a year, and every tailor, draper, and silk merchant of standing in the kingdom fought for a place in it. The great hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, chandeliers hung the whole length of the ceiling, and beneath them stretched row upon row of magnificent displays, bolts of shimmering brocade, gowns on stands like frozen dancers, coats of velvet and superfine, each booth grander than the last, each competing for the eye of the elite who drifted through in their finest evening dress, sipping wine and passing judgment. The famous houses had the front of the hall, great draped booths near the entrance, with their names painted in gold, footmen in livery, and crowds 3 deep admiring their work. Fenwick's booth was at the very back. It was a small thing, tucked into a dim corner near a service door, half in shadow, easy to miss, and easier to sneer at. Mr. Fenwick had secured it only through an old friendship with one of the exhibition's organizers, and it had taken the last of the shop's courage to accept it.
They had brought what little they had left, a few fine waistcoats, a walking dress, a length of Vivienne's own handwork, and arranged them as beautifully as they could on the modest stand. And there, in pride of place at the center, on a tailor's dummy of dark wood, hung the coat. The charcoal, superfine coat Vivienne had made for the Duke. He had sent it back to her 3 days before the exhibition with a single line in his own hand. "Display it. Trust me." She had not understood why he would return the very thing he had commissioned,
But she had done as he asked, because she had promised she would, and because trusting him was the only thing she had left. It hung in the shadows of the back booth, and even there, even in the dim light, anyone with eyes could see that it was extraordinary. Not that many people looked. The elite drifted past the back of the hall with barely a glance. A few paused, took in the modest booth and the plain old tailor and the girl in the gray dress, and moved on with a smirk. Vivienne stood beside the coat with her chin up and her hands folded, and she endured it, because there was nothing else to be done. Then Lady Margaret arrived. She came sweeping down the length of the hall in a gown of deep crimson, a small crowd of ladies and gentlemen trailing her like the tail of a comet. She had clearly been drinking the exhibition's fine wine, and her handsome face was flushed with triumph. She had heard, of course, that Fenwick's shop had dared to take a booth, and she had come to enjoy it. She stopped before the little back booth and looked it up and down, and her mouth curved. "Well," she said, loud enough for the whole corner of the hall to hear, "what have we here? I confess I did not think they would have the nerve." She turned to her crowd, playing to them. "This, my friends, is the famous Fenwick's, the shop that sews rags and calls them gowns. And this," she gestured at Vivienne with her fan, the way one might gesture at something on the bottom of a shoe, "is the little schemer herself, the one who has been chasing our poor Duke about the city." A ripple of cruel laughter ran through the crowd. More people were drifting over now, drawn by the spectacle, and Vivienne felt their eyes settle on her, dozens of them, cold and amused, and certain of what she was. "Tell me," Lady Margaret went on, warming to it, "by what right does a gutter apprentice stand in this hall at all? This is an exhibition for artisans of quality, for people of breeding, not for climbing little nobodies who trap gentlemen and pass off mended scraps as craftsmanship." She smiled, sweet and vicious. "You do not belong here, girl. You never have. Why do you not save yourself the shame and crawl back down the hill to whatever hole you came from, before you embarrass your poor master any further than you already have?" The laughter came again, louder. Mr. Fenwick stepped forward, his old face pale with fury and helplessness. "Now see here, my lady, you have no cause—" "It's all right." Vivienne put her hand gently on her master's arm. "It's all right." She stepped forward herself and faced Lady Margaret and the crowd and all those cold, amused eyes. Her heart was pounding. Her hands wanted to shake, and she would not let them. Everything in her screamed to run, to do exactly as the lady said, to flee this hall of candles and cruelty and never come back. But she thought of the coat behind her, and the hidden blue stitch, and a duke standing at a rainy window saying, "Trust me," and she found she could not run. Not this time. "You are right about one thing, my lady," Vivienne said, and though her voice shook, it carried. "I came from the lower district. My hands are rough from work. I have no breeding, and no fortune, and no fine name." She lifted her chin higher. "But everything on this stand I made. Every stitch with these rough hands, and I will not crawl anywhere, because I have done nothing to be ashamed of."
You may say what you like of me. You have decided what I am, and I cannot stop you. But I know what I made, and no rumor you invent will ever change one thread of it. The crowd went quiet. It was not the answer they had come to enjoy. There was something in the girl's plain, steady defiance that did not laugh well. Lady Margaret's face darkened. She had expected tears or flight, and she had received neither, and it made her cruel in earnest. "How dare you?" she hissed, stepping close. "How
dare you address me so? You forget yourself entirely, you insolent little—" She raised her fan as if she might strike the girl with words alone. "You are nothing. Do you hear me? You will be nothing when I am finished. I will see that shop shut and that old fool in the workhouse, and you—" "That is enough." The voice came from the far end of the hall. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through the crowd and the candlelight and Lady Margaret's rising fury like a blade through silk, and every head in the grand Capitol Hall turned toward the great doors at once. They had swung open, and a figure stood there, framed against the night, dressed all in charcoal superfine. The whole hall fell silent. The Duke of Ravenscar walked into the grand Capitol Hall, and he was wearing the coat. The charcoal, superfine coat. Vivian's coat. Cut close and severe, without a single ornament to draw the eye, and yet it drew every eye in the hall regardless, because it was, quite simply, the most perfectly made garment any of them had ever seen. It sat on his shoulders as though it had grown there. It made him stand straight and tall, the higher shoulder and the lower shoulder made even by a collar shaped just so, and he moved through the crowd like something out of a portrait come to life. A murmur ran through the hall, a low, rising sound of astonishment. The Duke of Ravenscar did not attend the royal exhibition. He had never once attended in living memory. He despised such gatherings, and yet here he was, and the sight of him in that coat silenced the whole room the way nothing else could have. He did not go to the front of the hall. He did not so much as glance at the great draped booths of the famous houses, with their gold-painted names and their liveried footmen and their crowds 3 deep. The finest tailors in the kingdom stood beside their finest work, and the Duke walked past all of them as though they were not there. He walked the whole length of the hall, straight toward the dim back corner, and the crowd parted before him in stunned silence, and he did not stop until he stood beside Vivian. Lady Margaret had gone white as her own crimson gown was red. "Your Grace," she stammered, dropping into a curtsy. We did not expect. How good of you to grace us with—" Alastair did not look at her. He looked at the coat on the dark wooden dummy, and then at the coat he himself was wearing, the identical coat, and then he turned to face the crowd, the whole gathered elite of the kingdom, every eye upon him. "This coat," he said, and his low, clear voice carried to the farthest wall, "is the finest garment I have ever owned, and I have owned a great many." He let that settle. No one breathed. "I have been dressed by the most celebrated tailors in Europe. I have worn the work of houses whose names are painted in gold above the booths at the front of this very hall, and none of them, not one, has ever made me anything to equal this." He ran a hand down the charcoal sleeve. "It was cut to make me stand straight where I have stood crooked for 20 years. It was built from wool, bargained for honestly in a cold warehouse before dawn. And there is a mark hidden beneath the collar where no critic will ever see it. A single stitch in midnight blue, because the person who made this coat could not bear to make anything at all without leaving her whole heart inside it." His grey eyes swept the crowd, and they had gone cold and hard as winter iron. "That person is not a schemer. She is not a climber, nor a fraud, nor a trapper of gentlemen, nor any of the filth that has been whispered about this city these past weeks, by people who could not sew a button and would not know true craftsmanship if it walked into a hall and stood before them." His voice dropped, and somehow that made it more terrible. "Her name is Vivian. She is the apprentice of Master Fenwick of the lower district, and she is, without any question, the most talented artisan in this kingdom." The silence in the hall was total. "I commissioned this coat as a challenge, Alistair went on. I told her it must be good enough to pass the scrutiny of the capital's harshest critics without them knowing a lower district girl had made it. His mouth curved, and there was no warmth in it for the crowd. So, here are the critics. Here is the coat. You have all admired it these past 2 minutes, more than you have admired anything at the front of this hall. You did not know who made it. Now you do. He looked slowly around the room. Tell me then, was it good enough? No one answered. No one dared. He turned at last to Lady Margaret. She had shrunk back into her crowd, and her painted fan trembled in her hand. You refused to pay this shop for a flawlessly mended gown, Alistair said, quietly enough that only the nearest guests could hear, which was somehow worse than shouting. You severed a contract over a repair so fine you had to press your face to the cloth to find it. You blackballed an honest master across the capital, and when that was not cruelty enough, you invented lies about a girl whose only crime was to be better at your own world's art than anyone born into it. His grey gaze pinned her where she stood. I know all of this, my lady, because I made it my business to know. And I promise you, before this entire hall, that every door in this city you have tried to close against her will now open, and every one you might try to open for yourself will find me standing on the other side of it. Lady Margaret made a small, strangled sound. Then she gathered her crimson skirts and fled through the crowd, and her tail of ladies and gentlemen melted away after her, no longer laughing, and the whole hall watched her go in silence. And then the strangest thing happened. Someone began to clap. It started somewhere near the middle of the hall, a single pair of hands, then another, then a dozen, then the whole vast room, the entire gathered elite of the kingdom, turning as one toward the dim back booth and the coat and the girl in the plain grey dress. The crowd surged forward, no longer sneering but eager, pressing toward the little stand, all of them suddenly desperate to see the work of the tailor the Duke of Ravenscar had crossed a whole hall to praise. Mr. Fenwick stood with his hand pressed to his mouth, tears streaming freely down his old face. 40 years. His father's shop and his, saved and lifted in the space of a single speech. But Vivian saw none of it. She saw only Alistair, standing beside her in the coat she had built with her own 2 hands, having just done the one thing she had never asked him to do, and never dreamed he would. Not thrown money at her trouble, not quietly bought it away, but stood up in front of the whole cruel world that had raised him and told them, plainly, that she was worth more than all of them. He had not rescued her, he had made them see her. You said, trust me, she whispered. I did. He looked down at her, and for the first time since the garden, the cold was entirely gone from his grey eyes.
And now they know your name. 3 days after the exhibition, Fenwick's shop could scarcely open its doors. They were queued down the lane, ladies in fine carriages, gentlemen in their best coats, merchants' wives and lords' daughters, all of them clamoring for the tailor the Duke of Ravenscar had crossed a whole hall to praise. The very same people who had cancelled their orders and crossed the street and refused to sell an old man eggs now stood in a line outside his door, hats in hand, begging for a fitting. Mr. Fenwick moved through it all in a happy daze. He had hired 2 new girls to help with the sewing and still could not keep pace. The drapers, who had demanded their money in coin, now sent their finest cloth on credit, hoping to be favored. The rent was paid a year in advance. And in the center of it all worked Vivian, calm and certain, drafting and measuring and cutting, turning away the orders she did not want and taking only those she did. Because she could afford, at last, to choose. They want you, not me, Mr. Fenwick told her, watching her fit a countess who had once refused to speak her name. Every one of them. They ask for the girl who made the Duke's coat. He shook his head, smiling. You could open your own shop tomorrow.
You could leave this old place behind and never look back." "This old place found me starving at 12 years old and gave me everything I have," Vivian said. "I am not going anywhere, Master Fenwick, but I thank you for the offer." He patted her hand, and his eyes were wet again, as they often were these days. That evening, when the last of the customers had gone and the shop was quiet, a footman in dark livery came to the door with a folded note. Vivian knew the hand before she opened it. "The Palace Gardens, golden hour, where you first tripped over a stone." She washed her face and put on her one good dress and walked up the hill in the long gold light of the fading afternoon. The palace grounds were empty this time. No ball, no violins, no golden light spilling from the great windows, only the gardens themselves, quiet and warm in the last of the sun, the rose beds heavy with early blossom, the gravel paths glowing amber. She found the low stone border easily. It was exactly where it had been that first cold night when her whole world had seemed to end. Alistair was waiting beside it. He was not dressed as a duke. He wore the charcoal coat, her coat, and no fine trappings, no cold formality, and when he saw her coming across the garden, his face did something it had never done in the marble hall or the shadowed booth. It softened entirely. "You came," he said. "You asked me to trip over a stone again," she said. "How could I refuse?" He laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, the laugh of a man who had not done much laughing in 31 years, and was only now learning how. "Do you know," he said, "I have stood in this exact spot 100 times, escaping 100 dreadful balls, and in all those years, the only thing that ever made the escaping worthwhile was finding a girl weeping into a wall." Vivian's cheeks warmed. "I was not weeping. I was despairing. There is a difference." "There is not." He came a step closer. "Vivian, I have something to ask you, and I have thought a great deal about how to ask it, because I know you, and I know that if I ask it wrongly, you will refuse me and be right to." He reached into the coat and drew out a folded paper. She went very still. "If that is money, Alistair, it is a contract," he said, "for a position. I wish to offer you the post of personal designer to the Duke of Ravenscar, my whole household, my every garment, and in time, if you wish it, your own house, in your own name, under my patronage, but never under my thumb." He held it out. "Read it, every word. You will find that it makes you answerable to no one, not even to me. You may take my custom or refuse it.
You may design as you please and turn away what you dislike. It secures your independence entirely, in writing, in law, so that no lord and no lady and no cruel word from anyone can ever again unmake what you have built." His grey eyes held hers. "I will not have you as a rescued girl, Vivienne. I would not insult you so. I want you as the finest artisan in the kingdom, working by her own free choice." Vivienne took the paper with hands that were not quite steady. She read it, every word as he had asked. And it was exactly as he had said, a contract that gave her everything and bound her to nothing, that made her his equal in her craft and his master in her own workshop. She looked up at him. "This is the position," she said slowly. "But it is not all you wished to ask me, is it?" The Duke of Ravenscar, who had faced down the whole elite of the kingdom without flinching, looked suddenly and entirely unsure of himself. "No," he admitted, "it is not." He drew a breath. "The position you may accept or refuse as a matter of business, and I will honor whichever you choose. But there is a second thing, and it is not business at all,
and I find I hardly know how to say it, because I have never in my life said it to anyone." He took her hand, there in the golden garden, and held it as though it was something more precious than any silk. "I did not fall in love with a girl I wished to save, Vivienne. I fell in love with a girl who refused to be saved, who shouted at me in my own study and told me I was wrong and was right, who mended a torn thing better than anyone alive and would not take a coin she had not earned. I have been cold my whole life because I believed everyone who came near me wanted the name or the money. And then you came, and you did not want either. You only ever wanted to be seen for what you truly are." He lifted her hand to his lips. "So I am asking, not the Duke, asking his designer, only Alistair asking Vivienne. Will you stay? Not as a servant, nor a subject, nor a rescued girl, as my equal, as my partner, as the woman I love." Vivienne looked at him, at the coat she had built with her own 2 hands, at the hidden blue stitch beneath its collar, at the man who had learned to ask instead of command, and who had crossed a whole hall and a whole world to let her earn her own place in it. "Yes," she said. "Alistair. Yes." He drew her close, there in the last gold light, in the very courtyard where she had once knelt weeping over a torn hem and thought her life was ending. It had not been ending at all. It had only just begun.